When we talk about genetics, there is one person that we cannot skip over because he is known as the father of genetics. His name is Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk who worked with pea plants to develop basically what is our basic understanding of genetics. So he's kind of who started this whole process of learning what's inherited from parents, why do we look like what we look like, and he used these plants called pea plants to observe these characteristics. So when we say he's the father of genetics, what even is genetics? Well, genetics is the scientific study of how traits are passed down from their parents to their offspring. So we're looking at how traits are, we're looking at your genes, which means that we're looking into your DNA. So how did Mendel go about figuring all of, this modern stuff out? Well, he studied 7 different traits within the pea plants. So when we say a trait, I mean a specific characteristic that varies in individuals. So he might have looked at, tall versus short, green versus yellow, red versus pink. We might consider a trait cleft chin, like what I have, dimples, freckles. These all are specific characteristics that vary in each of us as individuals. Once again, an example would be green seeds versus yellow seeds, or tall plants versus short plants. When he crossed these different plants, which means that he took them and had offspring based off of them, he came up with, he crossed the different plants with different traits, and he studied their offspring. So, for example, he would have crossed a tall plant with a short plant, and what he observed is that he had tall plants produced. He came up with, okay, well, why are only tall plants produced when it also had short? So he found out that there were things called hybrids. And when a hybrid would be something that, would be produced by a tall and a short, meaning these were tall, but we can't forget that they did have a short parent. So when he mixed these two different, he noticed that one of the traits went away. In this case, what trait went away? The short trait, right? So, but then he crossed those hybrids. And those hybrids, when he crossed them, he noticed that that trait came back. So the short trait, if we were to cross one of these tall plants produced by this couple here, then it might have, the other trait would have come back. So what does all of this mean? Well, when he looked at his results, I messed that one up. When he looked at his results, he came up with the following: that genes are passed down from parent to offspring. All right, we know 50 comes from mom, 50 comes from dad, 50%, I should say. Genes are a section of DNA that control that one trait. So when we talk about a gene, it's that section of DNA that controls that trait, that specific characteristic. There are different forms of a gene that create all specifics called alleles. So different forms that create all the specifics are the alleles. You'll get one from mom, one from dad. A plant may have one allele for tall and one short allele. All right, so it may have a tall and a short within its genes. So how do we describe this? Most organisms are going to have those two alleles for that trait. And we use 2 different words to kind of describe what we're talking about. If we're talking about how an organism looks, like for me, you can see that I have a cleft chin. So if I'm talking about that, I have a phenotype of a cleft chin. It's what I look like. It's what's expressed. In the pea plant, he noticed that the phenotype was tall because it was expressing that tall trait. Genotype, however, shows what types of alleles the 2 genes have. So for example, I might have a tall allele. We're looking at these pea plants. it might have had a tall allele from mom and a tall allele from dad. All right, so it made it and created two dominant alleles, which we'll look at tall being dominant later. So each one of these letters represents an allele. So what does it mean if something's dominant versus recessive? How do we know if something's dominant? Well, some alleles are going to be dominant to others. So they're going to be dominant, and some are going to be recessive, meaning they kind of hang back. If I'm dominant, I'm going to be strong. I'm going to express myself with confidence. And if I'm recessive, I'm going to kind of be like, ooh, I need a buddy before I can really express myself. So dominant genes in an organism, so an organism with a dominant allele will always show that form of a trait. So you're going to see its genotype expressed as big T, little t, or big T, big T. Now remember, there's going to be different letters thrown in there, but you're always going to see a capital and a lowercase or two capitals, and that will indicate that it will be dominant. It will show the trait. If it's recessive, an organism only shows the recessive form when there is no dominant form present. So remember I said it needs to have the little buddy, because it's kind of like, I don't know, do I want to do this, do I not? So it's going to need its buddy, and it will express itself only when there are two recessive. So dominant, it only needs one to express itself. Recessive needs two dominant or two recessive alleles. So, like I was saying, dominance is represented by upper and lowercase letters. So we're always going to use upper and lowercase to express, but we're always going to use the same letter. So if I'm looking at freckles, I'm always going to use, we'll say, an F to describe that allele, or that gene. Excuse me, the gene. So we're going to stick with our tall versus short. For example, we'll use a capital letter always to express the dominant trait. So in this case, tall is dominant, so we're going to use a capital letter to show tall. A lowercase letter is going to show, this should say, I guess I should keep that. A lowercase letter is going to be the recessive trait for tall plants, which means that if it receives if it receives two of those little lowercase letters, it's going to indicate that it's going to be a short plant, right? So let's look at our little chart. You got your genotype, which is what the alleles look like. You got your phenotype, which is what is actually expressed or shown, and then we've got a kind of name to describe that. If you have two capital letters, you're going to have a phenotype of the dominant trait. So for example, two capital letters means we're going to have a tall plant. And that is described as being homozygous dominant. Remember, the prefix homo means the same. So we've got, when you got the two letters being the same and they're both a capital, it's going to be dominant, homozygous dominant. Now, if we have a capital and a lowercase, what's going to be expressed? The dominant trait, right? So the phenotype is going to be tall plant, and we're going to call this heterozygous, or you might also see it known as being a carrier. So if you say somebody's a carrier, that means they carry this recessive gene, but they still express that dominant trait. Now, if their genotype is two lowercase letters, it's going to indicate that it is a short plant, right? Because that recessive trait is now being shown because it has a buddy. We call that homozygous recessive. Because, once again, our alleles are the same, except this time it's the recessive trait that is the same. So we're going to do a lot of practice with genotype, phenotype, crossing plants, what happens when people have children and what shows up, eye color, freckles, um, straight hairline, or a widow's peak. These are all things that we're going to look at to describe what makes up each of us as different people. So remember, hopefully you did your 6 blocks, and we will talk about this tomorrow. Rock on, or keep calm, and rock on, Hilburn Hawks.